All right, guys, we are outside again today. Another beautiful day. We're going to pick up on chapter 5. Over the next few days, my life fell into a new routine. I woke up and walked Jasper, then came home and prepped for sessions with Lucas. A lot of my other appointments got rearranged or handed off, which made both the patients and staff irritable, but I was racing against a deadline. Get him out of isolation by the end of the week, Dr. Mita had ordered, which meant I had less than 5 days to make Lucas Blackthorne play nice with others. I changed up the security I brought to our sessions, dragging along all genders and races. No one on support staff was smaller than me, but I found a petite, sweet looking nurse to come one day who agreed on the condition that I let her smuggle a can of pepper spray in her bra. Lucas looked each and every one of them up and down when they came into his room, as if scanning for weaknesses, but never took a step in their direction. I asked Carol, the kitchen attendant, to chat with him while he ate his meals, which she probably would have done anyway. After lunch, I took him to the men's group physical therapy in the gym. When we walked in for the first time, with Bryce and me shouldering him on either side and a security guard posted outside the door, he stopped short and surveyed the room. 20-odd patients, representing a spectrum of psychological disorders, were all doing yoga, or the Kongdon version of yoga. 3 or 4 actually followed the instructor's poses, while the rest either stayed in seated meditation or floated their own way. Big George was trying to balance on his head and shoulder with one arm reaching for the ceiling. A few stared at the walls, rocking back and forth. "What's wrong with them?" Lucas asked. "No more than what's wrong with you," I shot back without thinking, then cringed. But Lucas actually cracked a grin. It was the first time I'd seen him smile, and it made him appear like the teenager he was. "I look like that?" He nodded at Big George, who was waving gleefully at me. I waved back. We have patients with a variety of abilities. There are a dozen cognitive disorders in this room right now, but that's not who these men are. It doesn't define them. I bumped his shoulder with mine, a deliberately friendly contact that he received without any defensive reaction. "Come on, let's vinyasa." On the days group exercise went into the grounds, he had to stay in isolation. I couldn't take him outside, not only because he'd run, but also because I'd begun noticing something strange when I drove into work. People lingered outside the gates every morning when I arrived, staring into my car, pointing their phones at the building's facade. I didn't know who they were, but I knew instinctively who they were watching for. No one had stood outside Congham before Lucas's arrival. They'd never thought about the people living here, except to be grateful for the fence, for the line of demarcation that separated us from them. Since I couldn't bring him out, I brought the outside in. A handful of acorns that he built into a tower, a cup of powdery sand from Park Point Beach, a scattering of fallen leaves, their brilliant colors bleaching to brittle down. I didn't interrogate him, and I asked him nothing about his past, keeping my questions light. Did he like the food? No. Did he know how to read? Yes. I brought him books from the Congdon Library. First, the Lorax, then the Swiss Family Robinson, and read him passages from it. He listened without comment, always glancing at the orderly, the locked door, the bars encasing the window, crushing the leaves between his fingers until they turned to dust on the table. There were things that made sense about Lucas. He hated loud noises and tended to cover his ears when another resident began screaming. During group exercise, he flinched away from sudden bursts of laughter and stayed at the fringes of the room, gravitating toward the quiet misery of the dementia patients. He made absolutely no sound when he walked, and I found myself studying his footfalls, how he hit the floor with the ball of his foot, placing each step with the sureness of a lynx on a rocky slope. And, as much as I tried to draw him out, as sure as I was that he had absolutely no speech disorders, he spoke as little as possible. He gave one-word answers, shrugs, refusing to elaborate on any subject. His expression, the definition of involuntary. It was the other things, the stuff that didn't make sense, that kept popping up at 3 in the morning when I should have been at least resting, if not sleeping. But rest seemed impossible around Lucas. Like his tension was contagious. I hadn't brought up his comment from the first day. I know you, because it was wrong. All the time I'd spent in the Boundary Waters ended years before he and his father had gone missing. I hadn't met Lucas Blackthorne outside these walls. I would have remembered those ridiculous blue eyes, how they became sharper, eerier, the longer they stared at you. And he did. He studied me from the moment I walked into his room until the door closed between us. He watched my face, my hands, my shifting postures. Once I even caught him staring at my breast, and it would have been so much easier to say I was simply the first girl he'd ever met. Was there anything more fascinating to Hiruto teenage boys than breasts? But I couldn't make myself believe it. There was something more in his face, a caged fear that made me certain he wanted to snatch back those three whispered words. He knew me, and it made him afraid. I consulted with Dr. Mita every afternoon, sharing my session notes and my frustration. She had a stocked inventory of rational explanations. I might remind him of someone from his early childhood. I represented an institution he didn't understand or trust. He'd probably spent years in silence and solitude and could be dealing with a form of social anxiety. She coached me, soothed me, gave me fresh ideas and insight, and on the night before my last shift of the week, she told me there was a bed open in Ward 2. If he can maintain his self control through your session tomorrow, we'll transfer him to the common men's ward and see how he does. Her eyes narrowed. Challenge him. I believe he's ready for it. The next day, when I went to Lucas's room, I went alone. He was waiting for me in what had become his usual spot, cross-legged at the end of the bed, with the Swiss Family Robinson dog-eared on the mattress next to him, twirling one of the acorns I'd brought by the stem. When he realized no one was coming in behind me, his eyebrows lifted. Congratulations, I said, moving to the table. You've been upgraded to a lower risk status. Lucas followed me and sat down, carefully setting his hands palm down on the table, like always, a study in restraint. No more bouncers, I said, without knowing whether Stan was watching us through the door. And after today, you could be moving to a different floor. A different floor? He repeated it, and the tendons in his hands clenched. Not out. Not yet. We'll have to talk about other things when you're ready. I held his gaze and waited a beat, then two, as the silence built between us. It bubbled up again, the tremor of fear. No matter how much Dr. Mita tried to explain it away, the fact was he didn't react this way out of any of the other staff. Just me, as if he thought I alone knew something about him, something damning. Watching for any sudden movements, I pulled a large sheet of paper out of the surprise bag and unfolded it on the table. Lucas blinked at the map, and after a moment's hesitation, leaned in to study it more closely. This is Duluth. I pointed out Congdon's location on the summit of the hill, overlooking the entire city, then showing him some of the main areas and landmarks. After watching my finger trace roads and parks for a while, he asked where I lived, so I pointed to my neighborhood and talked about it. To my surprise, he started asking questions. How long had I lived in Duluth? Could I see the water from my house? Did I like watching the ships? Did I live alone? He processed everything I said before asking the next thing, and the next thing, and by the time I looked at my watch, the entire hour had almost elapsed. My heart kicked up as I reached into the bag for the other map and carefully unfolded it over the top of Duluth. This map was a wash of blues and greens, charting over 1,000,000 acres that stretched along the Canadian border for almost 150 miles. The lakes squiggled over the page, pouring into each other in rapids and waterfalls, creating endless waterways dotted with islands and hugged by fat peninsulas. The land was a sea of pine, fir, and spruce towering over the water, an evergreen empire built on less than 1 foot of topsoil before their roots had solid granite. I knew these shorelines and shadows, could hear the loons calling each other, and feel the razor gaze of the eagles soaring overhead. No matter how long you stayed away, the Boundary Waters never left you. Lucas recognized it immediately. I could tell, but instead of leaning closer and engaging as he'd done with Duluth, he braced himself against the back of the chair. It's your turn. I spread the map out, trying to make my voice as smooth as the paper. Tell me about your home. He was frozen for a moment. Then he sprung out of his chair and began pacing along the back wall, his shoulders tensed, hands fisted. My mind raced, wanting the answers only he knew, but afraid to push him too far and risk an episode that would keep him locked in isolation. I took a deep breath and spoke as calmly as I could. How long did you live in the Boundary Waters? I parroted his question to me back at him. He spun away and started tracing the wall, as if searching for fault lines. I waited, holding my breath. Then, just when I thought he'd gone nonverbal again, he spoke. 10 years. 2 words, and they opened up 100 questions in my mind. How did he know it was that long? Did someone tell him when he'd arrived at Congdon, or had he used some kind of calendar? Maybe he counted. Winter by bone-shuddering winter. Ignoring the impulse to press further, I moved to the next question he'd asked me. Could you see the water from your home? He turned, and registering my small smile, caught on to the game we were playing. I waited while he decided how he was going to handle round two. After a flickering glance at the map, he nodded. Which lake? I wanted to know. There were hundreds. Water in every direction. Water was the highway of the Boundary Waters. But again, I repressed the bubbling questions. Did you like watching the canoes? Another nod, and this one didn't surprise me. Some of the reporters had speculated on whether he'd been lost, painting melodramatic pictures of a boy trapped in the wilderness, desperate and alone. And maybe it could have been true for the space of one winter when campers were few and far between. In the summer, though, someone was always paddling quietly through the pristine woods. For a boy with the endurance to survive, help would have been easy to find. He hadn't reached out. He hadn't been lost. The Bigfoot stories, the wild man in the woods, were probably born of glimpses of Lucas skirting the edges of the campsites, watching the parade of humans from a comfortable distance. Then, the question we both knew was coming next. Did you live alone? I stood up and moved around the table, closing the distance between us. Lucas backed into the wall, and something dark flashed across his face. 10 years ago, your father, Josiah Blackthorne, took you camping in the Boundary Waters. You were 9 years old. He was 36. No one saw either of you again. Your campsite was found ravaged by what looked like a large predator, maybe a bear. And even though you've both been on the missing persons list all this time, everyone assumed you were dead. I thought of the photo they kept posting on the news, a half-lit shot of the dark-haired man and boy sitting on a dock. As a boy, Lucas had been slender and bright-eyed, leaning into his father's side and grinning at the camera, while the man stared past the lens toward the lake. The picture had been taken at a park in Iowa, 3 months before they disappeared. Do you remember your father? He let out a gun shy of a laugh, void of any humor, and his jaw trembled. There were memories, vicious, raging memories. How long was he with you? When did you last see him? He flicked his eyes on mine, exhaled unsteadily, and spoke. 15 days ago. I took another step forward, my mouth dropping open. You've been together all these years? He is alive? His head dropped and his voice came low and chipped. I don't know. Where is he? Why are you asking? His arms flew up, shoving me away, and I stumbled into the table before catching my balance. Agitation. Focused aggression. Instead of trying to calm him and de-escalate the situation, I put my finger on the wound and pressed. If he's sick or hurt, he needs help. Like you're helping me? He raged, pacing the perimeter again, but I put myself in his path, blocking his way. He tried to push me aside, but I grabbed his hand, not really holding it so much as arm wrestling in midair. We struggled for a minute. When he finally gave up, he jerked back against the wall and glared at me. I lowered our hands, keeping an awkward grip around his knuckles. I promised I'd help you get out, didn't I? He shook his head and stared at the locked door, his eyes filling with tears that he furiously blinked away. Not that way. I'm not turning him over. Not even if I have to rot in here. Turn him over? I repeated, my mind scrambling to catch up. He pulled his hand free and scrubbed at his face. I watched his chest rise and fall as he worked to bury the emotion. When he finally spoke, it was a horrible, quiet certainty. No one can help us. That's why we disappeared. Chapter 6. Karp Lykov was a man who had to disappear. In 1936, he lived in a remote village in Siberia and was working in the fields when a communist patrol shot his brother at his side. The Bolshevik government had made it their mission to systematically eradicate religion from the country, seizing church property, harassing believers, re-educating children, and executing priests, and the devout like the light goes. In the wake of his brother's murder, Karp gathered his wife and children and fled to the only place the communists couldn't follow, the taiga, 3 million square miles of unforgiving wilderness. They lived for over 40 years in total isolation, using only a few pots, a spinning wheel, and a loom for tools. The family built their log cabin by hand and planted crops on a mountainside, surviving famine and endless winters without any contact with the outside world. That is, until 1978, when a group of prospecting geologists happened upon them. By that time, Russia had changed. Instead of ordering executions, the government sent religious people to mental hospitals and diagnosed them with philosophical, philosophical intoxication. Psychiatry had become a political weapon, but one that couldn't touch the Lykovs. They refused to leave their wilderness home. They accepted few gifts from the geologists, and those only grudgingly, as though the pleasures of salt, forks, and paper were inherently sinful. Ultimately, it wasn't the spices or the tools that struck the Lykovs down, but a series of illnesses due to their harsh existence. One by one, the entire family died in the 1980s, except the youngest daughter, Agathia. Concerned, the geologist tried to convince her to return to civilization with them, but she refused. Standing sentinel near her family's graves, she urged the geologists to leave and waved them on when they hesitated. In her 70s now, Agathia Lykov still lives in the taiga, the place where she was born and where someday she's determined herself to die. Josiah Blackthorne is alive. Dr. Mita spooned spices from various pots into her pestle and began grinding them with the mortar. Her office filled with the familiar pungent fragrance, making the air heavy and sharp. It took 10 minutes to prepare a traditional chai, 5 minutes to let it cool, and another 15 for her to drain the entire pot while I pretended to sip my single cup. That was a half an hour, measured in blisteringly bitter tea for our monthly check-in sessions. That's why Lucas keeps trying to escape. It's not just leaving Congdon. It's not just the boundary water. He's trying to get back to his father. Believe me, Maya, she poured the spices into electric tea kettle and set a timer. No one is more gratified than me to hear Lucas has trusted you with this information. The U.S. Forest Service is making renewed efforts to locate Josiah, and any information from his son will help. They've canvassed the western area closest to L by both water and air, trying to find any trace of him, but so far have turned up nothing. What about Quetico? The Rangers wouldn't have any authority to search the Canadian Reserve, which extended the wilderness by almost another 2,000 square miles. To my understanding, they're working in tandem with the Canadian authorities, and she cut over my attempt to ask another question. We'll go over this in detail, I assure you. But right now, we're here to discuss Maya Stark, not Josiah Blackthorne. I dropped into my usual spot in one of her overstuffed chairs and stared at the moss-eaten trunk of an old oak outside the window. Dead leaves circled the ground around it, and its branches curled naked into the sky. There's not much to say. My boss trusted me with a challenging assignment, and it's taking over my life. What did you do this weekend? I'd spent most of it replaying my last conversation with Lucas and over to the beat of Jasper's paws hitting the boards of the lake walk, but she didn't want to hear that. I went to the hardware store. The nickel handles I put in the bathroom are all wrong. Copper would be perfect with the wood tones and the floor, but then I'd have to get new fixtures too. Is it possible, she ruminated while pulling out two squatty brown cups, that your fixation on this bathroom allows you to avoid other areas of your life, like remodeling the kitchen, like making friends, socializing, pushing yourself out of your avoidant attachment style and opening up, building relationships and trust. It all starts through meaningful interaction with someone outside of Congdon. I signed up for 3 different social media accounts in the last week. My phone's been going crazy. The notification buzzes had made my pocket vibrate all morning. I pulled the phone out and she came over, donning her glasses to examine the screen. Stephanie posted to Lucas Blackthorn's timeline. Lake Superior and 5K others liked at the real Blackthorn's tweet. She handed it back. The lake liked it? It's got an account too. Of course it does. Dr. Mita perched in a chair across from me. Behind her hung a framed quote that had been in this office for as long as I'd known her. It read, "What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us." Dr. Mita had spent 8 years and counting trying to counsel what lay within me. I said, "Meaningful interaction, Maya. I don't imagine you're contributing to these conversations, as it would violate HIPAA confidentiality." "No, but some of these people are obsessed, and I'm talking the clinical definition." I pulled up one of the apps and scrolled through the comments. They're reposting all the photos of Lucas, turning them into memes and artwork. I showed her a picture of Lucas's face, captured when they were transferring him to Congdon, superimposed over a forest. Another version showed him half in shadows, with the bottom of the frame bleeding into red. Someone posted "One Last Night of Josiah" fractured into a broken tile mosaic of greens and blacks, and the amount of detail and painstaking nuance must have taken hours, even days. They've divided into camps: people sympathetic to Lucas, who are outraged that he's here, and the others who want him to rot in prison for what he did to the Andersons. They think he killed his father and buried him somewhere in the Boundary Waters. The timer beeped, and Dr. Mita returned to the tea, stirring in milk and sugar with unhurried strokes. "Haven't you noticed the people outside?" I peered beyond the oak branches toward the entrance. Something moved near the guardhouse. It was too far away to identify, but the lurkers were out there. I'd seen evidence of them online. Pictures of the front entrance, and even blurry shots of patients walking through the grounds, which prompted rabid speculation on whether any of them could be Lucas. "Yes, the guards are aware of the issue. We've temporarily doubled security at the gate. Lucas has accumulated a large amount of fan mail, and some hate mail as well." "What?" My spine straightened. "Which is all the more reason," she brought 2 mugs over and handed one to me, "to get him to talk. The sooner the better. We need him to tell the authorities his story before the public superimposes their own. Eventually, Lucas will be rejoining the society, and we want him to be positioned to successfully engage with it, not recoil into a protective shell and redo his bathroom for the rest of his life." I swallowed the tea without tasting it, but the astringency still puckered my tongue. "Someday you have to teach me that trick where people think you're nice." Happily smiling, she inhaled the steam from her cup. "How about the day when you don't try to divert attention to someone else during your therapy session?" When I didn't reply, she took a sip and settled more comfortably into her chair. "Now, shall we discuss your progress in letting yourself form attachments, or would you rather talk about your fears of the L police?" Shifting, I took another bracing mouthful of tea. 20 minutes later, the check-in was over, and Dr. Mita kept her promise to tell me the details of the search for Josiah. The police wanted to talk to Lucas as soon as possible. Once winter came, the lakes would freeze over, and any search parties would be fighting sub-zero temperatures on snowshoe or by dog sled, and without Lucas's help, they'd be searching blind. I'd been shaking my head long before she finished. "He won't talk to them. He said he'd rot in here before turning his father over." "Doesn't that sound like his father committed a crime?" The police haven't mentioned any outstanding warrants. What else could he mean? Dr. Mita set aside her cup and laid a hand on my arm. You're doing a wonderful job with him, Maya, and I know this is frustrating, but you have to focus on reaching Lucas. His health is our priority. Work on gaining his trust, acclimating him, and hopefully we can get him to speak with the police soon. She turned back to the window. It seems the path to the Father is through the Son. I left her office, my stomach suddenly calm as I understood what I had to do. If I was going to get Lucas to talk, I needed to uncover what drove them into the boundary. Trace our steps back to that first leap, which brought me to a catch-22. The path to the Father might be through the Son, but the path to the Son was indisputably through the Father. To reach Lucas, I needed to know Josiah. In the following days, I didn't press Lucas to say anything further about his father or the Boundary Waters, which was good because adjusting to his transfer proved difficult. Ward 2, the high security men's ward, was exclusively used for forensic patients, the ones who'd been sent here by the courts rather than those who sought care of their own free will. Most of their crimes were the logical result of impulse and lack of control. Theft, creating a disturbance, resisting arrest, assault, with a few more serious offenses sprinkled in. One man had driven a car into a bus full of children with a homemade bomb that didn't explode. Another had hacked up his neighbors on Christmas Eve. That guy, a schizophrenic recluse, who some of the nurses called the Grinch behind his back, responded well to his meds and had been transferred here from the state security hospital after 10 years of perfect behavior. Sometimes he asked me to play Scrabble after I finished up with other sessions. He beat me every time. Ward 2 was laid out over one long wing for continuous sight lines. The staff station was encased in glass and always had at least 2 nurses dispensing medication, herding patients to their scheduled activities, and buzzing them between the common areas and the sleeping areas. The open living room boasted couches bolted to the floor and squishy chairs that didn't cause major injuries when thrown. Classical music piped in after lunch and dinner, and the walls were painted in soft grays and blues, like a cloudy day that might be clearing. I don't know if the window dressing made much of a difference with this crowd, though. To most forensic patients, Congdon was a prison, and they were serving a sentence with no release date. When security cleared me through on Monday morning for my first session with Lucas in the new ward, there was a scuffle going on in front of the TV, and I helped the orderlies break up what turned out to be a disagreement over a channel change. Lucas wasn't anywhere in the living room or adjoining dining room. I finally found him in a classroom next to the nurse's station, the room where different therapists taught social skills, life skills, art, even cooking. Lucas sat on the floor behind the rows of benches, visible to the wall of windows, connecting it to the nurse's station, but hidden from the group of men still arguing over the TV. One of them began shouting again, and I walked into the room in time to see Lucas burying his head in his arms and rocking on the floor. There you are! His head shot up at my voice, and relief swamped his face, startling me. I closed the door to the classroom, blocking some of the noise, and set up our session on one of the benches. He sat closer to me than I expected, and didn't even seem to consider whether he could use the felt tip pen I produced as a weapon. I gave him some loose leaf paper and asked him to start a journal. He frowned. Is that going to get me out of here? I uncapped the pen and put it in his hand. It's another step. Journaling can help synthesize experience. I explained how the act of writing engaged both hemispheres of the brain equally, making it a uniquely suited tool for processing and learning. Then he wanted to know about brain hemispheres, and we spent 20 minutes talking about cognitive function, the nervous system, and right versus left brain people. When the session was over, he touched the chipped silver polish on my fingernails and asked when I would be back, then watched from the safety of his classroom cave until I left the ward. He wrote halting paragraphs over the next few days, poorly spelled and sometimes hardly legible, commenting on how awful the food tasted, how loud his roommate snored, How many times he could hear an alarm shrieking through the echoing old walls of the building. Nothing that even hinted at his father or his life before Congdon. From what I could tell, he stayed as far away from the other patients as possible. He didn't socialize. He didn't speak when spoken to. He obeyed the staff directions on the second or third time given and sat through group classes staring out the window. One of his OCD roommates started monitoring Lucas and gave me a full report every time I appeared. Lucas gave his breakfast to Big George today. He went to the bathroom twice and stayed in the second time for 16 minutes. He's over there behind the second couch. And then, when Lucas saw me, he would immediately rise and follow me to the classroom. He began starting our conversations, asking questions, or bringing up points that he seemed to save up over the course of the day. Although, if Dr. Mita stopped by or anyone else entered the room, he would fall into a characteristic sullen silence. I played the part of his breezy friend, a warm and casual acquaintance, happy to chit-chat while correcting his spelling and grammatical errors. I brought him brochures for GED programs and college, which he didn't even glance at, a book of Sudoku puzzles, which he devoured with a rabid obsession, and Oreo cookies, which he spit out into a napkin after chewing one bite, making me question his entire capacity for judgment. The less I prepped for each session, the more he gravitated toward me. I didn't have time to wonder about his change of heart, though I was too busy researching his father. The internet, for all its wastelands and perversions, was sometimes a beautiful thing. I searched for Josiah in a People Finder database and got two hits, one of which was a 92-year-old man living in New Hampshire. I ordered a full background check on the other one, Josiah Blackthorne, age 46, aka J. Blackthorne, aka Joe Blackthorne, with a birth certificate registered in Detroit and previous addresses scattered all over the upper Midwest. There were no marriage certificates. He hadn't owned much property. A few trucks registered in his name every 10 years or so. No houses or anything that would have fixed him in one place for any length of time. He had received an associate degree in automotive technology in Illinois. Known relatives, two dead foster parents, and one child listed missing. I might have spent $50 only to find out Josiah Blackthorne had been a drifter, except for the arrest records. 1992, DWI. 1995, disorderly conduct. 1996, public intoxication, disturbing the peace. 1996, open container, attempted assault. And then nothing until a week before his disappearance when he'd been arrested for obstruction of justice in Elle, Minnesota, the same town where his son was taken into custody a decade later. Elle, the town I'd avoided for all of my adult life. There was no conviction or even a court record following that arrest, and no further information given. I stared at the bland paragraph, circled it, tried to Google it, and got no results. All the other arrests added up to a violent drunk, someone with a pattern of aggression who'd abruptly gone straight and kept his record clean. But obstruction of justice after so many years of living quietly? Justice for what or whom? After Lucas's emergence, none of the news stories mentioned that arrest, but the media had found a few other tidbits on Josiah. A couple of old co-workers gave interviews, describing him as a solitary guy who packed his son up to go hiking every weekend and camping for weeks at a time. One of Lucas's teachers remembered the two as being startlingly similar. Inquisitive, both asking follow-up questions, always wanting to know the whys and reasons for things, and of course, they looked a lot alike. The fluster, well camouflaged, but still there a dozen years later, and it wasn't hard to see why. I printed out the picture of Josiah and Lucas on the dock together and taped it to the refrigerator, staring at it every time I felt hungry. If Lucas had been a beautiful child, Josiah was the rugged, brooding, startling, handsome father. I didn't blush like the teacher thought. I looked closer. Next to the Blackthorns picture, I taped another one, a shot of the Lycoves taken by the geologist who discovered them. There was nothing pretty about the Lycove family. not on an aesthetic scale, but something in their expressions made me pause as I stood in front of the refrigerator eating lo mein out of the carton. Joy emanated from their faces, a basic and consuming happiness. One of the rangers who visited Agatha in her later years told a documentary crew that the taiga purified people. Bad people couldn't survive in those subarctic forests. The deadly ravines and icy bogs would swallow them whole. Taiga, he said, cleanses your soul. The boundary waters had the same power. I'd heard it in my mother's breath as she stared up at the glacier scarred cliffs. I'd seen it as we passed other campers porting their canoes and gear, their entire lives distilled into sweat stained backpacks with no room for abstractions, like justice or its obstruction. They possessed a peace. I realized, as the cold noodles slithered down my throat, that Josiah Blackthorn's face was screaming for. There were no outstanding warrants, Dr. Mita had said, but that final arrest struck in my head. What was it that Josiah had needed to cleanse from his soul? Chapter 7. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. Robert Frost. Josiah. For as long as he could remember, Josiah Blackthorn hated roofs. When he was a child, ice dams had formed on the eaves of his foster parents' house and melted through the ceiling, dripping into the cupboards, so all the food had to be stored in cardboard boxes, while his foster dad spent the rest of the winter in a pissing match with the claims adjuster. They were ugly things, ceilings. His social worker's office was covered with pockmarked foam tiles. The grocery store lived under dusty metal crossbeams, and he'd spent countless hours staring at the bug carcasses littering the fluorescent light fixtures at his school. There was always one shadow still moving, hurling itself against the plastic molding in frenetic arcs. But in all the time Josiah watched them, he never saw a single bug escape. All roofs came with a price. His foster mother showed them the gas and electricity bills every month. She did the same thing with grocery receipts and the register slips from Goodwill when they went clothes shopping. If you get something for free, she told all her foster children, that just means you don't know what it's going to cost yet. She wasn't an unkind woman, just mean with a dollar. She rubbed calendula on their cuts instead of buying band-aids, and made teas out of mullein leaves for their colds. As soon as the first spring rains came, she sent the boys into the woods behind the house, showing them how to find mushrooms, fiddlehead ferns, and dandelion greens. Josiah turned out to be a natural forager, instinctively memorizing the landscape, working his way further into the shadows and hills, where sometimes he would find a break in the trees and roll out an old sleeping bag so he could count the stars and hear his breath mingle with the scraps and chirps of fellow night explorers. It was worlds better than sleeping under a stained ceiling with whichever foster boy was spoiling for a fight that week. And as long as he came home with a basket full of morals, no one minded his absence. The only thing he liked over his head, his foster dad joked as he grew up, was the hood of a car. Engines intrigued Josiah at the same level as the woods. They were a mechanical ecosystem, and every part contributed to the function of the whole. He was the only kid in school who checked out books on cars and botany together. Eventually, his foster parents helped him get a job doing tune-ups and let him tinker with their rusting Chevys until he saved up enough money to buy one of his own. When the foster subsidies ran out on the day he turned 18, they gave him a second-hand tent, wished him luck, and sent him on his way. Josiah saw a lot of roofs over the next years, and sometimes he wondered if he was the only person who noticed them. Every garage he worked at had a mechanic who'd been there for decades, with skins so stained they practically disappeared into the oil splattered walls, and telling stories that always ended with, just you wait. Josiah didn't wait. He worked as long as he could before the ceiling started to close in, and the alcohol, which numbed much better than his foster mother's aloe vera, led to fights, cops, jails, and the uninvitable firings. Camping until he ran out of money, he ran to the next town, which started the cycle all over again. He fantasized about leaving it all behind, building a little cabin somewhere so remote he could never find a way back, when he met a hippie named Sarah Mason. The girl caught Josiah's eye the second she stepped out of her tent. She had dirty blonde ringlets spilling out of a bandana and tattoos peeking out of her tank top. Her nose was burnt watermelon pink, and she seemed to be alone too. Their tents pitched on adjoining campsites along Lake McBride in the tumbling hills of eastern Iowa. He leaned back in his camp chair as she tugged her boat down to the water. "Can I help?" he asked. "I doubt it." Flashing a smile, she set the boat in the lake without a backward glance. It was a two-person kayak, and she used the second seat to prop up her bare feet as she paddled away. It was the 4th of July in a year, no different from a half dozen before it. Josiah was between jobs again. He had a full cooler of beer, a week's worth of food, and every intention of not speaking to another living soul for as long as he could avoid it. Yet, all that mattered to him in that moment was watching the girl lift her face to the sun. She stroked leisurely across the lake, a solar-powered creature he'd never encountered in nature before. Every morning after that, he asked if he could join her, feeling more perverse each time she turned him down. She left the campsite in the morning and wouldn't return until dusk. He'd offer her a beer and the only chair at his fire when she walked by at night, which she politely declined as she zipped herself into the glow of her tent. Josiah wasn't used to rejection, at least not the sexual kind. Generally, when he walked into the first bar in a new town, mascara-smeared eyes lit up. He was a drifter, an outsider, and his otherness offered what they craved, what, by definition, they couldn't have in their everyday lives. The less he said, the more they wanted him, and he understood it. Women sought him the same way he sought the wild. This girl, though, had already found her wilderness. Hiking through the park during the day, he tried to answer the perpetual question that framed his life: where to head next. He'd been contemplating Canada lately, a good place for a man to be alone. But suddenly solitude had lost its appeal. He found himself hiking further into the park, circling the lake, trying to catch a glimpse of his elusive neighbor. She wasn't beautiful, she might not even be interesting, yet there was something always dancing behind her eyes, and he wanted to see what it did when it was set free. At the end of the week, when kids ran screaming through the campground with sparklers and someone lit illegal fireworks off on the other side of the lake, she was nowhere to be found. Her tent was dark, and she wasn't milling around with the other campers near the grills and playground. He wandered down to the beach and lay on the sand, watching the nation's birthday saluted with the traditional spectacle of exploding gunpowder. A patriot, huh? Out of nowhere she appeared, easing down on her back next to him, and he was surprised by the force of the leap in his chest. "More of a stargazer. I'm waiting for the smoke to clear." "Astronomy." She shrugged her shoulders deeper into the sand, making a nest. "Let's see who can name more constellations." That was the night he learned her name, that she was a graduate student from Iowa City, and that despite years of staring up at them, he could only pick out one constellation in the entire sky, because Orion and Orion's belt didn't count as two. The next day, Sarah let him kayak with her, and the week after that, he picked up his tent and drove to Iowa City looking for a job. He stopped drinking. Not right away, not cold turkey, but he didn't hate every room so much he needed to make them spin anymore, and he didn't want to waste another night trapped in a jail cell either. He pursued Sarah and leveraged her every swooning friend in his campaign to get her to date him, without any concept of how dating actually worked. He was awkwardly honest, willing to describe every sexual misdeed, every rancid night behind bars. She laughed at each story, infusing them with a lightness he couldn't have imagined before meeting her, like sliding into a mineral spring and experiencing the first buoyant heat. He learned her likes and dislikes, and the meaning of every tattoo on her body. But the most important discovery he made about Sarah Mason, one night, when he walked her home after class, was that she also hated roofs. Her sister had locked her in the toy box when she was 3, and she'd been claustrophobic ever since. Lecture halls were tolerable if they had windows, but she couldn't bear small waiting rooms, and the only time she tried boarding an airplane, she began hyperventilating and then screaming as soon as the cabin doors closed. So instead of asking to come into her apartment, he found a bench overlooking the river, and they talked all night. And when the sun rose, she kissed him until he forgot whether they were inside or out. They went camping together, voyaging farther and farther into parks across the country with one tent and two kayaks, because Sarah liked having space to stretch out. He taught her to forage, how to distinguish the edibles and the medicinals from the indigestibles and the poisonous. When they moved in together, tiny miracles began happening every day. She asked where he was going when he left in the morning. It mattered where he was, and whether he was sick or angry or thirsty or cold. Her love was a gift that asked for nothing in return. At night, he gathered her close and talked about their cabin in the woods, because he couldn't see himself anywhere now without her. "You're my sky, my everything," he whispered in the dark, and he was right, until the day his son was born. Lucas meant illumination, light giving, and there was nothing more clear than the first time Josiah held his son and stared into his own eyes. Only a few minutes into life have the power to unmake a man, and cradling that raw, barely formed human was Josiah's first. He fell in love, and it was terrifying. The next years were the happiest and the hardest. Josiah worked as much as he could, stockpiling money for some vague future debt whose shadow seemed to loom infinitely larger every month. They learned about car seats, and that back is best, breast is best, the five S's, and all the other hundreds of slogans and campaigns thrust into their lives by American baby culture. Ignoring as much of it as they could, they bought an infant life vest instead of a crib monitor and took Lucas down his first river at 3 months old. And Lucas was light giving. He played games with his own shadow, entertained himself with bugs for hours, and scaled out of his crib to squirm his way in between his parents every morning before dawn so they could watch the sunrise together. Still, they couldn't entirely escape the tedium and the rules. At Lucas's first kindergarten conference, they were admonished by the teacher that he should have been more socialized. Lucas looked at the other children like they were aliens and refused to stand quietly in line. Josiah laughed off her shaming, but it ate at Sarah the whole way home from the conference. She tucked Lucas into bed and stalked back to their living room, raging at the teacher with the assembly line attitude, ripping up the conference papers. And when she whirled to hurl them at the trash can, a blazing tornado of ringleted fury, an aneurysm burst in the frontal lobe of her brain, and she fell backward, eyes open and staring at the cracked plaster of their ceiling. That was the other moment, the worst moment. It was a strange thing to be 32 years old and know beyond all doubt you'd already experienced the highest and lowest points of your life. When Josiah looked back on it later, from the lonely mouth of a forgotten river, he understood the price of Sarah's love. His foster mother had warned him, but he hadn't grasped at the time, with her penny pinching ways, that cost meant more than money. Sometimes cost meant being carved down with grief. It meant fighting with the hospital to release Sarah's remains to him because he wasn't a legal relative. And when they finally did, it meant lying awake at night, wondering if she wanted to get married, if he'd made her sacrifice any portion of her infuriatingly finite happiness. Cost meant leaving Iowa City because he couldn't face playing with Lucas in the parks or walking the pedestrian mall without Sarah. Her love weighed down the air, made it almost impossible to push in and out of his lungs, so they moved, and for the rest of his life Josiah never kayaked again. "Nothing in this world is free," his foster mother said. "You just haven't found out what it's going to cost yet." Lucas was his last greatest gift, and he was prepared to pay anything, to forfeit the entire world and everything in it to keep his son safe. They drifted from town to town, staying in one place for the school year, but packing up as soon as the last day let out in June, and disappearing into the wild. Zion, Yosemite, the Sawtooth Mountains, the Grand Canyon. All his savings made sense now. They paid for the summer spent gazing at sunsets and exploring the craters of ancient volcanoes. Josiah taught him survival. It was all for Lucas now. Everything he'd ever learned for this one giggling, scampering reason. Lucas could build a fire at 8 years old and fillet his own fish to cook over it. He hoarded maps and began campaigning for their summer destinations as soon as Christmas was over, which they usually spent in a snow-packed tent somewhere near the latest rental. When they were camping, Lucas didn't wake in a cold sweat crying for his mother. They talked about her over the campfire. Josiah grafting his memories onto Lucas's fading ones, and always found sites near the water where she would have wanted to be. There were women, a whole new breed, who saw a single father as another asset in an already impressive list of attributes. They slipped their phone numbers to him with restaurant bills, and at the laundromat, their eyes smug with intent. He hated them almost as much as he hated himself for being tempted, for wanting to betray Sarah's love. One woman asked him to come look at her Honda, and when he came to her house, slid her hand up his arm and inquired how much more he charged for extra services. He ripped the radiator hose out of her car and left her screaming in her driveway. After a summer spent in the Badlands, they drove all the way up to L, a weathered cluster of stores and houses where the road ends at the edge of Minnesota. The town was surrounded by green, national forests, state parks, and a place called the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, and that intrigued by its very name. The Boundary Waters, a boundary between countries, between worlds, dividing the life he'd had with Sarah and the one that had called to him from dark horizons since he was a child. He found an advertisement in the L paper to sublet half of a duplex and drove their truck full of camping supplies and tools to a house with peeling paint and a patchy dandelion-strewn lawn. The woman who answered the door was bone thin, with crocodile teeth and sharp, hungry eyes. Yes, her glance measured up Josiah, Lucas, and the truck behind them, loaded with everything they own in the world. We called about the apartment. Right, it's your lucky day. The rusting hinges shrieked as Heather Price opened the door wider. There's a special right now. First month free. Hey,
Hello.
what are you doing?
I was mowing.
You were mowing.
I was mowing. In fact, I just stopped because I think I'm just about out of gas.
Oh,
So I don't want to be run out of gas back end of the lawn.
ah.
So what you up to?
Not much. I actually just stopped reading. I'm doing some recordings for the live book readings that I'm putting on YouTube. Um, so I just stopped reading, and then my phone started ringing. Um, I'm house sitting, so at the world's like most beautiful place ever. It's this huge little farmhouse. They have a pond, they have a waterfall, it's an old farmhouse. It's like a little piece of town, and I'm not working today. This is not me. Oh yeah, I just read outside for like an hour and a half.
Okay. Well, what kind of dinner are you out today?
2 poodles and 2 cats. Yeah. In some of the videos, you can see Juliet walking past. So yeah. Um, how did you do it? Yeah, tell her I said hi. Okay.
I don't know where the speaker is because I have a headset on.
Oh.
I have my headband on. I don't know where the speaker.
actually is. Yeah. Huh. Um. Yeah. So, so you're back to splitting your time at your house and Steve's house.
Yes.
Is that a good
I
thing?
need gas. I need gas.
Uh, so is it a good thing that you're splitting your time, or is this just like a
Oh, please, he misses me.
yeah?
Yeah. It's it's lonely.
Yeah. You coming,
It's
Romeo?
lonely. Huh?
I was talking to the dog. So the two poodles, the black one is Romeo, and the black and white one is Juliet.
Huh?
They're so cute. They enjoy their time with me outside. Well, don't stand in the doorway. Yeah.
A good one?
Uh huh. Oh, they're good. Yeah. Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. They,
Oh, okay.
they are good. They're like the most well behaved. I know you want your soup one. They're the most well behaved dogs ever. Romeo likes to sleep in bed with me at night. Juliet has to have a full bed if she can't sleep in bed with me. So she comes in and looks at me, and then she's like, "Yeah, I'm going to the other room." And then like I'll go check on her, and she is sprawled out across this full size bed. Like there's no room for anybody. So she's sleeping in a no. This is like her own bed. It's a guest bedroom, so she's sleeping in like a human bed, like sprawled out. And they have dog beds all over the place. But when we go upstairs,
Oh yeah, they want you to stay late. Yeah, they want the house occupied because Romeo's. And they like the TV side. They like when I sit inside. You know, they like. Yeah.